The letter arrived sealed in wax the color of dried blood, and Cordelia Winslow read it twice before she let herself believe what it offered her. Her father would never know she had answered it herself. In a hand not her own, under a name that was not hers. Lady Beatrice Ashby, spinster aunt to the Duke of Sherrington, needed a companion for the season. Someone literate, discreet, willing to manage correspondence for eyes that had grown too weak for close work. Cordelia had written back within the hour. Miss Cora Vane, the letter said, would arrive within the fortnight. In 3 weeks she was to marry a man she had never seen. The contract had been signed when she was 16, and he was 25, 2 fathers settling a debt over port and a handshake. And in 7 years she had received exactly 4 letters from her intended, each of them shorter than the last, each of them signed only Sherrington, as though even his own given name were too much of himself to spend on her. The county said he was cold. The county said worse. Her old nurse said a man who would not write his own bride a proper letter was a man with something to hide, and Cordelia, who had spent 7 years being traded like a promissory note between 2 estates, had decided she would rather know the truth of him before she wore his ring than after. So, she came to Sherrington Hall 3 weeks before her own wedding, under a false name, to find out what kind of man was waiting for her. She saw him before she knew who he was. A big bay gelding had gone lame in the stable yard, and a man in shirt sleeves, no coat, no cravat, sleeves shoved to the elbow, knelt in the mud with the animal's hoof cradled against his knee, working a stone free with his bare fingers while a groom hovered, wringing his hands, clearly certain he ought to be doing this instead of watching his master do it. The man did not look like a duke. He looked like a man who had learned, somewhere, that if he did not do a thing himself he could never be entirely sure it was done right. "Easy," he said to the horse, in a voice pitched low enough that Cordelia felt it before she heard it. I know it hurts." Nearly there. The stone came free. He ran his thumb along the frog of the hoof, checking, and only then looked up, straight at her, standing forgotten by the gate with her single trunk and her 2-plain bonnet, and something in his face closed, the way a door closes when a stranger walks into a room mid-argument. "You're not one of the grooms," he said. "No, Your Grace." She had not meant to say Your Grace. She had meant to wait, to watch, to gather herself before she ever had to address the man she was contracted to marry as though she were a servant curtsying to him. But his eyes had come up brown and startled and entirely unguarded for the half-second before he remembered himself, and something in her had simply answered the truth of what she saw rather than the plan she'd made on the road. He rose, wiping his hands on a handkerchief that had clearly seen better afternoons, and did not apologize for the mud, or the shirt sleeves, or the fact that a duke had just been discovered on his knees in a stable yard doing a groom's work with his own hands. "Then you have the advantage of me. Miss Vane. Come to assist Lady Beatrice." Something in his shoulders eased, fractionally, as though he had braced for a different kind of stranger, a magistrate, a creditor, a name from his own ledger of troubles, and found only a companion instead. "She'll be glad of you." Her eyes aren't what they were. He hesitated, and she watched him decide, visibly, to say the next thing anyway. "You didn't flinch." Just now, most people who find a duke elbow deep in a horse's foot pretend not to have seen it. "Should I have pretended, Your Grace?" "No," he said, and almost smiled. "God. No. I'm sick to death of pretending." "Don't you start." The groom finally found his nerve and took the gelding's lead, murmuring something about a poultice, and the duke straightened to his full height, remembering, visibly, that he was a duke and not merely a man kneeling in mud. It did not suit him half so well as the mud had. "Forgive me. You've had a long journey, and I've kept you standing in a stable yard discussing my own bad manners." He glanced toward the house, and something wary came back into his face. The shutter closing again. "My aunt will want you settled before supper. I'd advise you not to mention to the rest of the household that you found me like this. It does not do, apparently, for a duke to be seen doing a groom's work." "I shan't breathe a word, Your Grace," Cordelia said, and meant, though she did not say it, that she had already decided this was the truest thing she would learn about him all season, that he did the hard, unglamorous work of his own house with his own hands, whether or not anyone was watching, and had simply assumed, until this moment, that no one ever was. He did not know it, but he had just told his intended bride the truest thing he owned, and the wanting look on his face when he said it was not the look of a cruel man. It was the look of a man who had been lonely so long he no longer recognized the shape of it. Cordelia curtsied, murmured something about finding the housekeeper, and walked into Sherrington Hall, with her pulse going like a struck bell, already half undone by a man who did not yet know her name, and already keeping, without quite deciding too, the secret of exactly how long she intended to stay silent about it. The household absorbed her within a week the way a pond absorbs a stone, a ripple, then stillness, then no sign she had ever been anything but always there. Lady Beatrice was sharp-tongued, half-blind, and delighted to have someone who could read her correspondence without mangling the Latin tags her late brother had been so fond of scattering through his letters. It was Lady Beatrice who first put a ledger in Cordelia's hands. "The steward's figures give me a headache," the old woman said, "and my nephew has no patience for columns. You have an educated hand, Miss Vane. Tell me if anything looks amiss." It was, Cordelia would come to understand, the most dangerous kindness anyone had ever done her. She had kept her own father's accounts since she was 14, out of necessity, and then out of something like love for the neat, honest architecture of numbers that added up to exactly what they claimed to. She sat with Sherrington's ledgers in the estate office most afternoons, and it was there, 3 days later, that the Duke found her with ink on her fingers and his cousin's handwriting spread across the desk. "You read faster than my own solicitor," he said from the doorway, and did not sound as though he minded. "Your Grace, if I'm troubling you, you're not." He came in, dropped into the chair across from her without the ceremony a footman would have used to announce his sitting, and looked, for a long moment, simply tired. "May I tell you something I have told no one in this house?" She should have said no. She said, "If you wish it. In 3 weeks I am to marry a woman I have never met." He said it flatly, the way a man reports weather. "My father arranged it before he died, to settle what he owed her father, and I have spent 7 years writing her exactly as little as courtesy demands, because I did not want to give a stranger any more of myself than the law was already taking. I don't know if she's kind. I don't know if she reads. I don't know if she'll look at this house and see a title or a man." He glanced up, and something in his face had gone unguarded again, the same unguarded she'd seen in the stable yard. "You're the first person in a year who's looked at me the way you're looking at me now, like I'm someone you're still deciding about, not someone you've already priced." The words landed in her like a struck nerve, because she was the stranger he dreaded, sitting across the desk from him in a false name, and she could not tell him so without ending the only honest conversation of her engagement before it had properly begun. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "she is doing exactly what you're doing now, deciding, before she commits herself, whether the man is worth the marriage." He looked at her for a long moment. "I hope to God she is," he said, "and I hope to God I pass." Later that week he showed her his mother's garden, walled, half-wild, roses gone leggy, and unpruned along a south wall he tended himself on Sunday mornings, when he thought no one watched. "She died 6 years ago," he said, kneeling to clear a bed of bindweed with the same bare-handed carefulness she'd first seen in the stable yard. "My father let the rest of the grounds go to the devil rather than pay a gardener what one was worth. This corner I keep myself. It's the one dishonest thing I do, pretending, an hour at a time, that nothing here has changed." He looked up and caught her watching him with something too soft in her face to hide fast enough. "You look at me as though that isn't foolish." "I don't think it's foolish at all," she said, and meant it entirely, and understood, with the roses at her knees and his sleeves rolled to the elbow beside her, that she had come to Sherrington Hall to find a reason to refuse this man, and had instead found every reason not to. The trouble arrived, as trouble in that house always did, wearing Francis Ashby's face. He was the Duke's cousin, heir presumptive should Sherrington die without a son, and he had managed the estate's day books for 3 years, with the proprietary ease of a man who considered them nearly his own already. Cordelia had disliked him from her second week, quietly, the way one dislikes a floorboard that creaks under no apparent weight, until the night of Lady Beatrice's small supper for the neighbouring families, when he cornered her near the sideboard with a smile that did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "You've a remarkable head for figures, Miss Vane, for a lady's companion. I noticed you'd corrected 3 of my entries this week." "I found 3 errors, Mr. Ashby. I corrected them." "How careful you are." He set down his glass. "One might almost think you'd been trained to it. Or sent to it." His voice did not rise, but it carried, and 3 heads at the nearest table turned. "Tell me who exactly recommended you to my aunt. I find I cannot place the family." "Vane. Of where? Precisely." The room's attention gathered like weather. Cordelia felt the old, familiar instinct to shrink, and set it aside deliberately, the way she had learned to set aside everything that would not serve her. "Of Dorset, sir, though I fail to see how my origins bear on a column of arithmetic." "They bear a great deal, when a stranger is given the run of a duke's private accounts within a fortnight of her arrival." He turned, smiling, toward the room at large now, toward the Duke himself, who had gone very still near the fireplace. "I only ask, cousin, because a man in your position cannot afford to be careless about who reads his ledgers. Especially not now. Especially not now hung in the air with the particular menace of a thing said to be understood by exactly one person and no one else." The Duke's jaw had tightened. For one long, terrible moment Cordelia watched him weigh his cousin's blood against a companion he had known 3 weeks, and she understood, with a lurch, that she was about to be asked to leave. "Francis," Lady Beatrice's voice cracked across the room like a dropped tray. "I invited Miss Vane into those ledgers myself, because my own eyes are failing, and yours, I begin to suspect, are failing in a different fashion. If you have found an error, name it plainly. If you have found nothing, sit down." He sat down, but his eyes found Cordelia's once more across the candlelight, and there was nothing in them now but a promise that this was not finished, and Cordelia, heart still slamming from how close she had come to being sent from that house, with her purpose unfinished, and her heart already, irretrievably, given away, understood that she had made an enemy who had a great deal more to lose than her own. Good name. She found the truth of it 4 nights later, alone in the estate office with a candle burned to its last inch, and 3 years of ledgers spread across the desk like a confession. The tenant rents did not match the totals carried forward. Small sums at first, a few pounds here, a rounding error there, the kind of thing an honest eye might miss, and a careless one certainly would. But traced back across 3 years they became a river. Not a trickle. All of it diverted through entries in Francis Ashby's own hand into an account that led, when she followed the correspondence tucked behind the ledger's backboard, to a gaming house in London, and a debt of his own he had been quietly paying down with his cousin's tenant's money. She sat very still for a long moment with her hand flat on the page, and understood that she had come to this house to test one man's character and had instead uncovered another's crime, and that the two discoveries were now entirely, dangerously tangled, because she loved the Duke of Sherrington with a completeness that terrified her, and the only way to protect him was to become, in secret, exactly the kind of schemer his cousin had accused her of being. "I thought I came here to decide whether I could bear to marry him," she thought. "I never once considered that I might have to save him instead." She did not tell him that night. She told him 3 nights later, in the library, past midnight, when the household slept, and he found her there because he could not sleep either, a habit, she had learned, born of 3 years managing a debt his father had left him with no one to share the weight. "You've been different since the supper," he said, low, standing closer than propriety allowed, and neither of them stepping back. "Francis frightened you. Francis threatened me," she corrected, "which is a different thing, and I begin to think he did it because he has something worth threatening over." Cora, her false name in his mouth, at that hour, in that lower voice, undid something in her chest she had been holding rigid for 3 weeks. "Whatever it is, tell me. I would rather know the worst of my own house than be spared it by a woman He stopped. "By a woman you what? Your Grace?" He was close enough now that she could see the exact brown of his eyes gone nearly black in the candlelight. Close enough that his hand had come up, unthinking, to the side of her face, his thumb resting just at her jaw the way it had rested against the rim of his glass that first week, unconscious and absolute. "By a woman I have come to want a great deal more than I have any right to want anyone. 3 weeks before I marry a stranger," he said, and the space between them had gone to nothing, his mouth a breath from hers, and she felt the whole of her resolve, 7 years of careful contract and careful silence, come apart at the seams. A footstep sounded in the corridor. They broke apart before either of them had chosen to, and the moment closed like a fist, leaving her breathless and furious at the world for its timing, and aching, for the length of one held breath, with wanting the thing that had almost happened badly enough to weep. "Cora," his voice had gone rough, and he did not step back so much as make himself remember the distance that ought to exist between a duke and his aunt's companion. "I am promised to a woman I have never met, in 17 days' time, and I have just come nearer to kissing you than I have come to touching anyone in 3 years. Tell me I am the only fool in this house behaving badly tonight." "You are not the only fool, Your Grace," she said, and it was the truest sentence she had spoken to him since her arrival, "though I suspect I am the greater one, for reasons I cannot yet tell you." She made herself step back the rest of the way, out of the candlelight, before the ache in her chest undid the little sense she had left. "Good night." She did not sleep. She lay awake, counting the 17 days, like a woman counting the rungs of a ladder she was no longer certain led anywhere she wished to climb, and understood, somewhere past midnight, that the test she had come to Sherrington Hall to conduct had ended weeks ago, and that what remained now was only the question of whether she would have the courage to tell him so before his cousin did it for her. She chose her moment 3 days later, in the estate office, in broad daylight, with Lady Beatrice as witness, because some things, she had decided, could not be done in shadow without becoming shameful by association. "Mr. Ashby has been diverting the tenant rents," she said, laying 3 years of ledgers on the desk between them, her hand steady, though her heart was not. "Here, and here, and here, traced to an account of his own, and from there to a gaming house in London. I can show Your Grace every entry." Francis went white, then red, then reached for bluster. She is a companion of unknown family accusing the heir presumptive on the strength of her own arithmetic, On the strength of your own handwriting, cousin, the Duke said. And his voice had gone somewhere Cordelia had not yet heard it go, quiet and absolutely without mercy. I know my own cousin's hand. Francis, I have known it since we were boys. He looked at Cordelia, and something in his face was disbelief and gratitude and a dawning, ferocious pride all at once. You did this. Alone, while I stood in that library, asking you to tell me your fears, and you were already carrying proof of his. I did it because it needed doing, Your Grace, and because I could. She held his gaze, and did not flinch from what she said next. You needn't look at me as though I've done something owed an apology. I am not the one who has been stealing from you. Ask yourself what you mean to do about the one who has. Francis's eyes went from her to his cousin, and found no mercy in either face. You'll regret trusting a woman you can't even properly place. Cousin, he spat and stood, and left the room with what dignity a man can carry out of a room he has just been ruined in, which was very little. Lady Beatrice, who had said nothing at all during the exchange, waited until his footsteps had faded down the corridor before she spoke. I have suspected him for the better part of a year, and lacked the eyes to prove it. You will forgive an old woman for saying she is rather glad she invited a stranger into her house. She fixed Cordelia with a look far sharper than her failing eyes ought to have allowed. Whoever you truly are, Miss Vane, and I have my suspicions. Mind, an aunt is not so blind as her nephew. You did this house a service today that no dowry could have bought it. I hope, whatever comes, my nephew has the sense to know it. The Duke did not look at the door Francis had gone through. He looked at Cordelia and reached, slowly, for her hand across the ledgers and said, Whoever you are, Cora Vane, you are the bravest person in this house. And she felt the words like a blade, because she was not brave enough, yet, to tell him the rest. Francis Ashby was not a man who left a room ruined without one last throw of the dice. It took him 2 days to find, among her few belongings, the single object she had been careless enough to keep, a signet ring, small, a woman's ring, bearing the Hartley crest, tucked in a glove box she had thought no one would search. It took him 1 evening more to place that crest, and 1 letter, sent express to a solicitor he knew in town, to have the answer confirmed. He did not go to the Duke first. He went to Lady Beatrice, in front of 2 visiting neighbours, and said, smiling, I wonder if my cousin's household knows precisely who has been sitting in his private accounts these 6 weeks. Miss Vane, is it, or should I say, Lady Cordelia Winslow, daughter of the Earl of Hartley, and, unless I am very much mistaken, the very bride his father's contract has already promised him. The room went silent in the particular way rooms go silent before something breaks. The Duke found her an hour later in the corridor outside her room, and his face was not angry. It was worse than angry. It was the face of a man watching an old wound reopen exactly where he had learned, years before, to expect it. Is it true? Julian, is it true? His voice cracked on the second asking, and it was the first time she had ever heard him use anything less than iron. You came into my house under a false name. You let me tell you things I have told no living soul. You let me stand in that library 3 nights ago, and nearly— He stopped himself, jaw working. Was any of it real? Or was I simply being assessed, the way a horse is assessed before a sale? Did my own bride come to see whether the merchandise was worth the price her father already paid? I came because I was afraid, she said, and her voice did not shake, though everything in her did, because 7 years of silence from you taught me to expect a stranger's cruelty, and I would rather have discovered it before my wedding than after. I did not stay for the deception, Your Grace. I stayed because I fell in love with a man mending his own horse's hoof in the mud, and I did not know how to stop being that man's friend long enough to tell him the truth without losing him. And yet you managed it, he said, low and raw, to lose me anyway, and turned and walked away from her down the corridor and did not look back. And 3 days later a note arrived at Sherrington Hall from the Earl of Hartley confirming that his daughter would arrive, as contracted, on the morning of her wedding, as though the woman who had spent 6 weeks in his house had simply, quietly, ceased to exist. She had spent 3 days believing she had lost him entirely. 3 days in her father's house being fitted for a wedding gown, for a groom who now knew her name and, by every account, reaching her through her maid, wanted nothing further to do with the woman who had worn it. Her father, when she finally told him the whole of it, had not scolded her. He had only said, quietly, that he had signed that contract when she was 16, because he wanted her settled, not because he wanted her miserable, and that if the Duke of Sherrington could not forgive an honest fear, honestly confessed, then he was not the man either of them had hoped he was. And if he could, then perhaps the whole ridiculous 6 weeks would turn out to have been the wisest thing his daughter had ever done. It was cold comfort on the morning of a wedding neither of them was certain would end in anything but humiliation for them both. The chapel at Sherrington stood full on the appointed morning. Both families, the neighbouring gentry, Lady Beatrice in the front pew, with her chin set like a woman braced for a funeral rather than a wedding, and the Duke of Sherrington stood at the altar in a coat too formal for the man Cordelia had watched kneel in stable-yard mud, waiting to marry a bride he had told himself. Grimly, he would learn to be civil to, because he did not think his heart had anything left in it to give a second time. The doors opened, the bride came down the aisle in ivory silk, with her chin lifted and her father's arm beneath her hand, and the Duke of Sherrington looked up, prepared for a stranger, and found Cora Vane walking toward him instead, and the whole chapel watched the colour drain from his face and then flood back, as something entirely unguarded broke across it in front of 200 witnesses. "You," he said, not quietly at all. "I did try to tell you," Cordelia said, close enough now that only he could hear it, every single day, in every way I had courage for. I am sorry it took a wedding to finish the sentence. For a moment neither of them moved, the whole chapel holding its breath around them, the vicar's prayer book still open and forgotten in his hands. Julian looked at her the way he had looked at her that first afternoon in the stable yard, as though deciding, still, what kind of woman stood in front of him, and then something in his face simply gave way. 7 years of dread and 6 weeks of longing collapsing into the single, unguarded relief of a man who realizes the stranger he feared and the woman he loves have been, all along, one and the same person. He might have answered her. He did not have the chance, because Francis Ashby, 3 pews back, rose to his feet with the particular desperation of a man who has just watched his last hope of inheriting a dukedom disappear, and said, loudly enough to carry, "This marriage is founded on fraud, Your Grace. The woman deceived this household for 6 weeks, under a false name, and I would ask any man of sense whether a bride who lies so easily can be trusted at all." On the subject of trust, Cordelia said, turning to face him with the whole chapel watching, her voice carrying clean and level to the last pew, "I have here 3 years of your own ledgers, Mr. Ashby, in your own hand, showing every pound of tenant rent you diverted to your creditors in London, copies of which are, as of this morning, already in the hands of the family solicitor and 2 magistrates of this county. I lied about my name for 6 weeks out of fear of a marriage I did not choose. You stole from your own blood for 3 years out of nothing but greed, and called it caution when a woman caught you at it. I will let the room decide whose deception was the graver sin." The silence that followed had teeth in it. Francis's face went the colour of old ash, he looked once at his cousin, found nothing there but contempt, and fled the chapel with the whole of Sherrington and half the county watching him go, and did not return to the county again. The Duke of Sherrington turned back to his bride, and there were, for the first time in 6 weeks, no more secrets standing between them at all. "You let me fall in love with a companion," he said, "when you were already my wife by contract. You let me grieve you as a stranger for 3 days when you had never truly been one. I ought to be furious with you. You may be furious with me for the rest of our lives, Your Grace, if you'll only be furious with me as your wife." "Julian," he said. "You may call me Julian. You've earned considerably more than that." And then, in front of both families and the whole assembled county, the Duke of Sherrington took his bride's face in his scarred, ungloved hands and kissed her as though 6 weeks of careful distance had been a debt finally, thoroughly paid, and the chapel, scandal and all, broke into the kind of noise no vicar has ever fully controlled. The following spring, the walled garden at Sherrington Hall bloomed in every bed at once. Roses, trained properly along the south wall by a gardener the Duke had finally consented to hire, though he still knelt in the dirt most Sunday mornings out of habit, rather than need. Cordelia found him there on a warm April morning, sleeves rolled, hands in the soil, exactly as she had first seen him, except that now he looked up at the sound of her step and did not startle, only smiled, the way a man smiles at a thing he has stopped being afraid of losing. "The ledgers came back from the new steward this morning," she said, settling onto the bench beside the roses. "Every column accounted for. It is, I confess, the most satisfying reading I have done all year." "You would say that." He came to sit beside her, brushing the dirt from his hands, and rested his palm over the small, unmistakable curve of her waist beneath her shawl. "Francis writes from the colonies. Incidentally, some minor post his mother's family secured him, after the magistrates were done with him and the money was repaid. He says the climate does not agree with him. I find I am not moved to sympathy." "Nor I." She leaned into his shoulder, watching the roses nod in the spring wind, the same wall, the same corner he had once tended alone as the one dishonest hour of his week. No longer dishonest now, no longer a pretense that nothing had changed, because everything had. "A year from this morning," she said, "I think we shall sit in this exact garden with someone considerably smaller, demanding to know why the roses have thorns. And you will explain it to them exactly as patiently as you explained everything to a stranger in a false name, 6 weeks before you ever knew you loved her." Julian Ashby, Duke of Sherrington, who had once believed the whole of his life was a ledger someone else had already balanced against him, took his wife's hand among the roses his mother had planted and he had never stopped tending, and found, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that the account of his own happiness had finally, entirely, come right.